1620, the Pilgrims landed expecting wilderness. Instead, they found something impossible: cleared fields, empty villages, and graves beyond counting. Thousands of indigenous people had vanished. The land was silent, fertile, and haunted. They called it divine providence. It was actually plague. This is the catastrophe that made Plymouth possible, and the one man who survived to witness both worlds die. Before the emptiness, there was abundance. The coast of what the English would call New England was one of the most densely populated regions in North America. From the Kennebec River in present-day Maine to Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, tens of thousands of indigenous people lived in permanent villages, seasonal camps, and trading centers. They called themselves by many names: Wampanoag, Massasoit, Nauset, Patuxet, Pennacook, Abenaki. They spoke dialects of the same Algonquian language family. They traded, intermarried, and sometimes fought, but they shared the land, the waters, and a way of life that had sustained them for thousands of years. The coast was particularly rich. Massive cod, striped bass, and bluefish filled the waters. Shellfish beds stretched for miles. In spring, rivers exploded with migrating alewives, shad, and salmon, so thick you could almost walk across their backs. The indigenous people had engineered the landscape for productivity. They built fish weirs, intricate wooden traps that channeled fish into enclosures where they could be harvested by the thousands. They burned underbrush and controlled fires, creating park-like forests where deer, turkey, and other game thrived. They planted corn, beans, and squash in cleared fields using sophisticated intercropping techniques. This wasn't wilderness. It was managed, cultivated, and prosperous. One of these villages was Patuxet. Located on a harbor the English would later rename Plymouth, Patuxet sat at the mouth of two rivers with easy access to both ocean fishing and inland hunting. Archaeological evidence suggests the site had been occupied seasonally for thousands of years and permanently for at least several centuries. By the early 1600s, Patuxet was home to approximately 2,000 people, a substantial settlement by the standards of the time. Families lived in wetis, dome-shaped houses made from bent saplings and covered with bark or woven mats. The structures were warm in winter, cool in summer, and could be assembled or moved as needed. The village had everything a community required: fresh water from clear streams, cornfields stretching across cleared bottomlands, fishing weirs in the rivers, clam beds along the shore, and forests filled with game. Patuxet was part of the larger Wampanoag Confederacy, a political alliance of dozens of villages led by a paramount sachem. The Wampanoag controlled much of present-day southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, trading extensively with neighboring nations. Among the people of Patuxet was a young man named Tisquantum. We don't know his exact age. Indigenous communities didn't record birth dates the way Europeans did, but based on later events, he was likely born in the 1580s or early 1590s. He would have grown up learning the rhythms of Patuxet life, planting corn in spring, fishing in summer, harvesting in fall, hunting in winter. He would have learned the language, the stories, the spiritual practices. He would have known every path through the forest, every fishing spot, every family in the village. It was a good life, stable, secure, connected to ancestors stretching back beyond memory. But by the early 1600s, something new had appeared on the horizon: European ships. French, Basque, and English fishermen had been coming to the North Atlantic for decades, harvesting the rich cod fisheries off the Grand Banks and the New England coast. They established temporary camps on shore to dry fish and repair nets. Initially, contact was limited and often peaceful. Indigenous people traded furs, corn, and fresh meat for metal tools, cloth, and glass beads. The Europeans stayed for a season, then left. It seemed manageable. But the ships kept coming, and with them came things invisible and deadly. In 1614, an English captain named Thomas Hunt arrived on the Massachusetts coast. He was part of an expedition led by John Smith, the same Smith who'd been captured by Upich and Caniff in Virginia. Hunt's orders were to trade and explore. Instead, he decided to take captives. Under the pretense of trade, Hunt lured indigenous men aboard his ship. At Patuxet, he invited about 20 young men to come see English goods. Tisquantum was among them. Once they were aboard, Hunt's crew seized them. They locked the captives below deck. At another nearby village, Hunt kidnapped more, eventually taking 27 men total. The captives fought, screamed, begged, but Hunt's crew overpowered them. From the shore, the people of Patuxet watched in horror as the ship sailed away, carrying their sons, brothers, and husbands. Hunt sailed directly to Malaga, Spain, where he intended to sell his captives as slaves. The going price for an indigenous American was 20 pounds sterling, a fortune. For Tisquantum, everything he'd known vanished in an instant. His family, his village, his entire world gone. He was chained, sold, and transported across an ocean into a civilization he couldn't comprehend. But Tisquantum's story didn't end in Spanish slavery. Spanish law, influenced by Catholic Church doctrine, technically prohibited enslaving indigenous Americans, though it was widely ignored. Local friars in Malaga discovered Hunt's illegal cargo and intervened. The captives were freed from slavery, though they couldn't go home. They were stranded in Europe, thousands of miles from everything they knew. Tisquantum somehow made his way to England, possibly with the help of merchants or ship captains who saw value in having an indigenous interpreter. By 1617, he was living in London, working for a shipbuilder named John Slaney, who had interests in the Newfoundland trade. Tisquantum learned English, learned European customs, survived in one of the largest, dirtiest, most disease-ridden cities in the world, and he never stopped trying to get home. By 1619, after 5 years in captivity, he'd secured passage on a ship headed for New England. He had no idea that during his absence, everything had changed. The world he'd left in 1614, prosperous, populated, alive, no longer existed. Patuxet was gone, and Tisquantum was about to become the sole survivor of a catastrophe beyond imagination. Tisquantum's journey through captivity took him through 3 countries and exposed him to the beating heart of European civilization and its darkest corners. After the Spanish friars freed him from immediate slavery in Malaga, Tisquantum faced an impossible situation. He was legally free, but practically trapped. Spain in 1614 was not a place where an indigenous American could simply walk to a port and book passage home. He had no money, didn't speak Spanish, had no legal status. And he was visibly, unmistakably foreign in a society that viewed difference with suspicion. The friars who'd rescued him may have housed him temporarily, possibly attempting to convert him to Christianity. Spanish religious orders saw indigenous peoples as souls to be saved, which was paternalistic and colonizing, but at least opposed outright enslavement. Somehow, the exact route is unclear because Tisquantum left no written account and appears only fragmentarily in English records. He made his way to England. He may have traveled with English merchants who traded between Spain and London. He may have worked as a servant or laborer to pay for passage. The journey likely took months, possibly years. By 1617, Tisquantum was in London, living in the Cornhill district, working for John Slaney, a shipbuilder and investor in the Newfoundland Company. London in 1617 was staggering in scale. With a population approaching 200,000, it was one of the largest cities in Europe. The streets were narrow, filthy, crowded. Buildings leaned over cobblestone alleys where human waste ran in open gutters. The air was thick with coal smoke. Disease was endemic. For Tisquantum, coming from Patuxet, a village of 2,000 spread across fields and forests, London must have been overwhelming. But it was also an education. He saw technology that didn't exist in Patuxet. Massive ships with complex rigging, metal forges, printing presses, multi-story stone buildings, wheeled carts, and firearms. He witnessed the machinery of empire. The trade networks, the wealth, the power that allowed a small island nation to project force across the globe. He learned English fluently. Not just basic communication, but complex negotiation, storytelling, and cultural nuance. This would later save his life and make him invaluable. He also saw European poverty, cruelty, and disease. London's streets were filled with beggars, orphans, and the sick. Public executions were common entertainment. The class divisions were stark and brutal, and everywhere, disease. Londoners lived with illnesses that would devastate Patuxet. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, these circulated constantly through the city. Outbreaks killed thousands regularly. Children died so frequently that families didn't name them until they survived past infancy. But Londoners had been exposed to these diseases for generations. Those who survived childhood had some immunity. It was simply the background noise of urban life. Tisquantum, having survived his own childhood in Patuxet, likely had some resistance to local diseases. But he had no idea that the same pathogens he lived with daily in London, harmless to him now, would be apocalyptic if introduced to populations without prior exposure. He had no concept of epidemiology or immunity. No one did. Germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 250 years. While in London, Tisquantum met other men involved in American exploration. One was Ferdinando Gorges, a military commander and investor in colonial ventures. Gorges was fascinated by indigenous people and had hosted several captives brought back by explorers. Gorges saw Tisquantum as useful. A potential translator and guide for future expeditions. He supported Tisquantum's efforts to return to New England, not out of kindness but calculation. In 1619, Tisquantum finally secured passage on a ship captained by Thomas Dermer, an explorer working for Gorges. Dermer was sailing to New England to map the coast and assess opportunities for English settlement. Tisquantum would serve as translator and intermediary with the indigenous peoples they'd encountered. After 5 years in captivity, enslaved in Spain, stranded in London, working in a foreign land, Tisquantum was going home. The voyage took weeks. Crossing the Atlantic in a small wooden ship was dangerous. Storms, disease, starvation if the journey took too long. But Tisquantum had survived worse. When the coast of New England finally appeared on the horizon, Tisquantum must have felt overwhelming relief. He was home. He'd see his family, his friends, his village. He'd tell them everything he'd seen, everything he'd survived. He had no way of knowing what he was about to find. As Dermer's ship sailed south toward Patuxet, Tisquantum began to notice something wrong. The coastal villages should have been visible, smoke from cooking fires, canoes in the water, people fishing. But there was nothing, just silence. They landed at several sites. Each one was abandoned, houses collapsed, weirs broken, cornfields overgrown with weeds and bones. Everywhere bones, skulls, rib cages, scattered skeletons lying where they'd fallen, unburied, unmourned. Tisquantum didn't understand where was everyone. Dermer's crew grew nervous. They'd expected to trade with thriving villages. Instead, they'd found a graveyard. Finally, they reached Patuxet. Tisquantum climbed ashore and walked into his village. It was empty. The houses were collapsed or burned. The cornfields were wild tangles of weeds. The fishing weirs were broken. The paths were overgrown, and the dead were everywhere. Skeletons lay in doorways, stared from empty eye sockets. Some bodies had been buried hastily in shallow graves. Others had been left where they fell, picked clean by scavengers. Tisquantum searched, called out names, ran from house to house. No one answered. His family dead. His friends dead. His friends dead. Every person he'd known's dead. 2,000 people gone. Tisquantum was the sole survivor of Patuxet. The magnitude of his loss is almost incomprehensible. Imagine returning home after 5 years to find your entire city dead. Every person you've ever known, parents, siblings, cousins, neighbors, everyone, rotting in the streets. No explanation, no warning, just silence and bones. Tisquantum collapsed among the ruins of his village and wept. He didn't know what had killed them. Didn't know what had killed them. Didn't know why he'd been spared. He only knew that the world he'd fought for 5 years to return to no longer existed, and he was utterly, devastatingly alone. Tisquantum was enslaved in Europe. A catastrophe was unfolding along the New England coast. It began sometime in 1616, probably in the summer or early fall. People started getting sick, high fevers, agonizing headaches, swelling in the neck and armpits, skin turning yellow, bleeding from the nose and mouth. Then death, usually within days, sometimes within hours. It spread like wildfire through coastal villages. One person fell ill, then 5, then 20. Entire families died within a week. Healers who tended the sick became sick themselves. The disease didn't discriminate. It killed children and elders, warriors and sachems, the strong and the weak. And it didn't stop. From the Penobscot Bay in present-day Maine down to Cape Cod, village after village was hit. The Massasoit, Pawtucket, Pokanoket, and Nauset all suffered catastrophic losses. Survivors later told English explorers that the dead were so numerous they couldn't bury them all. Bodies piled in houses. Lie in fields. They were left where they fell because the living were too weak, too sick, or too few to manage a proper burial. Dogs and wolves fed on corpses. The smell of death hung over the coast. Some villages tried to flee. They packed what they could carry and moved inland, away from the coast, hoping distance would save them. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. They carried the disease with them. Other communities isolated themselves, refusing contact with neighboring villages. This strategy worked better, but it fractured social networks and trade relationships that had existed for generations. Spiritual leaders tried everything. Healing ceremonies, herbal remedies, prayers to the Manitus, the spiritual powers that govern the world. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. The disease was beyond anything they'd experienced. Indigenous peoples of the Northeast knew illness, infections, injuries, seasonal sicknesses, but nothing like this. Nothing that killed so many so quickly, so indiscriminately. By 1619, when the plague finally burned itself out, the death toll was staggering. Modern historians and epidemiologists estimate that 50% to 90% of the indigenous population along the Massachusetts coast died in just 3 years. The Massachusetts, who'd numbered perhaps 20,000, were reduced to a few thousand. The Patuxet were nearly annihilated. Patuxet was completely wiped out, except for Tisquantum, who was thousands of miles away when it happened. The Wampanoag Confederacy, which may have had 20,000 people in 1615, had perhaps 5,000 by 1620. Entire villages ceased to exist. Political structures collapsed. Trade networks disintegrated. Cultural knowledge died with the elders who carried it. But what was the disease? We'll never know for certain. No indigenous written records exist from this period, and English observers didn't arrive until after the plague had ended. The descriptions that do exist, second-hand accounts from survivors, are fragmentary. The symptoms suggest several possibilities. Bubonic plague. The swellings in the neck and armpits match bubonic plague, which is transmitted by fleas from infected rats. European ships carried rats, and a single infected rat could start an outbreak. Plague had ravaged Europe repeatedly, most famously in the Black Death of the 1300s. Europeans had some population-level immunity. Indigenous Americans had none. Leptospirosis, a bacterial disease spread through water contaminated by animal urine. The yellowing skin, jaundice, and rapid onset match leptospirosis. European ships dumped waste overboard. Coastal trading zones could have been contaminated. Viral hemorrhagic fever. The bleeding and rapid death could indicate a virus like yellow fever or dengue, both of which can be transmitted by mosquitoes. European ships brought mosquitoes as stowaways. A combination. Multiple diseases may have struck simultaneously, each weakening the population and making them vulnerable to the next. What's certain is that the source was European contact. For decades, European fishermen and traders had been visiting the New England coast. They established temporary camps. They traded with indigenous people. They left behind goods, waste, and unknowingly pathogens. The indigenous peoples had no prior exposure to Old World diseases. Their immune systems had never encountered these microbes. They had no inherited resistance, no cultural knowledge of how to treat them, and no time to adapt. When the diseases finally crossed into indigenous populations, the results were apocalyptic. This pattern would repeat across the Americas for centuries. When Europeans arrived in the Caribbean, the Taino population collapsed from millions to thousands within decades. When the Spanish reached Mexico, smallpox killed millions of Aztecs. When colonists pushed west, epidemics preceded them, devastating indigenous nations before face-to-face contact even occurred. Disease was the most effective weapon of colonization, and it was completely unintentional. The Europeans who visited New England in the 1600s had no concept of germ theory. They didn't understand how the disease spread. They had no idea that their mere presence was lethal. And when they arrived in 1620 and found the coast depopulated, they didn't mourn the catastrophe. They celebrated it. Because from their perspective, the empty land wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. Cleared fields with no one farming them, villages with no inhabitants, rich fishing grounds with no competition, and they had a ready explanation. God had cleared the land for them. It was divine providence, they said. The Almighty had swept away the heathens to make room for Christian settlers. It was proof that God favored their mission, that they were chosen to build a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. This interpretation served multiple purposes. It justified taking indigenous land. God had given it to them. It reinforced their sense of moral superiority. They were the righteous recipients of divine favor, and it absolved them of guilt. If God wanted the indigenous people gone, who were they to question it? But God hadn't cleared the land. European diseases had, European rats, European waste. European waste. European contact. The plague that devastated coastal New England was made as any war, even if it was unintentional. And the people who died, the thousands of men, women, and children whose bodies littered the coast, weren't obstacles removed by divine will. They were victims of a biological apocalypse caused by forces they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight. Tisquantum had survived by accident of geography. He'd been kidnapped and taken to Europe, where he was exposed to European diseases and likely developed immunity. When he returned in 1619, he found a coast of ghosts, and he was the only one left to remember what had been lost. Tisquantum spent days wandering through the ruins of Patuxet searching for survivors. He checked every collapsed house, every overgrown field, every path through the forest. He called out names until his voice was raw. Nothing. No one. The silence was absolute. No children playing, no women were singing they worked, no men returning from hunting, no dogs barking, no smoke from cooking fires. Just wind through empty doorways over abandoned fishing weirs. Captain Dermer and his crew gave Tisquantum time to grieve, but they didn't stay long. The emptiness unnerved them, and there was nothing to trade if there was no one alive. They sailed north along the coast, and everywhere the story was the same. Abandoned villages, scattered bones, overgrown fields. At some sites, they found small groups of survivors, hollow-eyed, traumatized people who'd lost entire families. These survivors told Dermer about the sickness, how it had come suddenly, how the dead had piled faster than they could bury them, how entire villages had been erased. Dermer documented what he saw in letters back to England. He described fields that had been cultivated but were now empty, villages that had once housed thousands, now silent. He estimated that the indigenous population had been reduced by 90% in some areas. I passed along the coast where I found some ancient plantations, not long since populous, now utterly void, he wrote. In other places, a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. For Tisquantum, each abandoned village was another blow. He'd hoped Patuxet was an isolated tragedy, that neighboring villages might have survived, that he might find distant relatives, friends, or someone he knew. But the plague had been comprehensive. It had swept the coast like a scythe. Eventually, Dermer's expedition reached the territory of the Pokanoket, the leading tribe of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Their principal village under Sachem Massasoit had survived, diminished, but intact. Tisquantum, having no other options, stayed with the Pokanoket. He was not welcomed as a long-lost kinsman. He was viewed with suspicion. Where had he been during the plague? Why had he survived when everyone else died? His story, kidnapped by Englishmen, enslaved in Spain, living in London, sounded impossible. Some suspected he'd brought the sickness somehow, that his presence was cursed, and his fluent English was deeply troubling. Speaking the language of the kidnappers, the slavers, the people who'd brought so much death, it marked him as tainted, contaminated by European contact. Tisquantum occupied an impossible space. He was Patuxet, but Patuxet no longer existed. He was Wampanoag, but he'd spent 5 years in European captivity. He spoke English like a colonizer, but he'd been enslaved by them. He was a man between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Massasoit allowed him to remain, but kept him at arm's length. Tisquantum was useful as a translator and source of information about the English, but he wasn't trusted. Throughout 1619 and into 1620, Tisquantum lived among the Pokanoket, mourning a world that no longer existed. He visited Patuxet periodically, walking among the ruins. Maybe he buried some of the dead. Maybe he performed rituals to honor their spirits. The records don't say, but he couldn't rebuild. One man can't resurrect a village of 2,000. The land itself was changing. Without constant management, the controlled burns, the field clearing, the weir maintenance, the forest was reclaiming cleared areas. Deer populations exploded without hunting pressure. Fish weirs collapsed. Cornfields became tangles of wild growth. The landscape the Pilgrims would find in 1620, which they'd describe as virgin wilderness, was actually an abandoned garden, returning to forest after the gardeners died. Tisquantum also had to reckon with the terrible question: why him? Why had he survived when everyone he loved died? Was it random, divine, punishment? In Wampanoag spirituality, everything happened for a reason. The Manitou spiritual powers governed the world with purpose. Disaster wasn't random. It was meaningful. But what did the plague mean? Some survivors believed they'd angered the spirits somehow. The sickness was punishment for violating taboos or failing in rituals. This interpretation was crushing. It meant they'd brought the catastrophe on themselves. Others believed it was malevolent sorcery from enemy tribes. This interpretation at least offered a target for revenge, a way to channel grief into action. A few suspected the English. The timing was suspicious. The sickness appeared after increasing European contact. Maybe the foreigners had brought it somehow. This interpretation was closest to the truth, though no one understood the mechanism. They didn't know about microbes, immunity, or disease transmission. They just knew. English ships arrived, and death followed. Tisquantum had his own guilt to carry. He'd been spared because he was kidnapped. If he'd been in Patuxet when the plague struck, he'd have died with everyone else. His survival felt like cosmic cruelty. He was alive to witness the destruction of his world, with no power to stop it or rebuild it. In November 1620, as Tisquantum struggled with grief and displacement among the Patuxet, a ship appeared off the coast. The Mayflower, carrying 102 English colonists, was searching for a place to settle. They'd originally intended to land in Virginia, hundreds of miles south. But storms, navigational errors, and the late season forced them to land in Cape Cod instead. They explored the coast searching for a suitable site. They needed fresh water, cleared land for planting, and a defensible position. In late December, they found it. A sheltered harbor, 2 clear rivers. Fields are already cleared and ready for planting. No inhabitants. It was perfect. They had no idea they were standing on a mass grave. They called it Plymouth. Tisquantum, hearing that English colonists had settled at Patuxet, must have felt the universe collapsing inward. Collapsing in the place where he was born, where his family lived and died, where 2,000 people had built lives over generations, now occupied by the very people whose ships had brought the plague. It was monstrous, unbearable, but it was also an opportunity. Because Tisquantum had something no one else possessed. He spoke English, understood European culture, and knew the land intimately. He was the only person who could bridge the two worlds. And he was about to use that position in ways no one expected. Massasoit, sachem of the Patuxet Wampanoag, faced an impossible situation. Before the plague, the Wampanoag Confederacy had been one of the most powerful political entities in southern New England. With perhaps 20,000 people spread across dozens of villages, they controlled territory from Narragansett Bay to Cape Cod. Massasoit's authority rested on his ability to mediate between villages, organize collective defense, and manage trade relationships. He was not an absolute ruler. Sachems led through consensus, generosity, and respect, not coercion. But the plague had shattered everything. By 1620, the Wampanoag population had collapsed to perhaps 5,000. Entire villages had been wiped out. My God. The complex network of alliances and kinship ties that held the Confederacy together was in tatters. Worse, Massasoit's enemies had been less affected. The Narragansett, who lived to the west in present-day Rhode Island, had been partially spared. The plague had hit them, but less severely. Possibly because they had less direct contact with European traders. While the Wampanoag lost 3/4 of their population, the Narragansett lost perhaps a third. That meant the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Before 1616, the Wampanoag and Narragansett had been roughly equal in strength. Now, the Narragansett outnumbered the Wampanoag significantly, and they were aggressive. Narragansett war parties began raiding Wampanoag territory, seizing land, demanding tribute, humiliating Massasoit's weakened confederacy. Massasoit couldn't effectively resist. He didn't have enough warriors. His people were demoralized, traumatized, and fragmented. If the Narragansett decided to invade in force, the Wampanoag would be conquered. Massasoit allies, urgently. So when he learned that English colonists had established a settlement at Patuxet in December 1620, he faced a critical decision. The English were invaders, squatters on Wampanoag land. The moral and traditional response would be to drive them out, but the English had guns, ships, metal weapons. They were potential military allies against the Narragansett. Massasoit had to weigh competing risks, tolerate the English presence and use them as leverage against the Narragansett, or attack them and potentially make powerful enemies. He chose pragmatism over principle. He would approach the English, offer alliance, use their military strength to shore up Wampanoag security. But there was a significant problem. Language. Massasoit spoke no English. The colonists spoke no Wampanoag. Meaningful negotiation would be impossible without a translator. And Massasoit had exactly one person who could serve that role. Tisquantum. Tisquantum was an obvious choice. He spoke fluent English and knew European customs. But he was also a problem. He was an outsider, contaminated by years among the English. He had no family, no village, no traditional place in the social structure. He'd survived the plague under suspicious circumstances. Could he be trusted? Massasoit didn't have much choice. Tisquantum was the only translator available. So in March 1621, Massasoit summoned him. He explained the plan, approached the English, negotiate an alliance, secure mutual defense against the Narragansett. Tisquantum's role would be critical. He'd translate, explain Wampanoag intentions, and help navigate the cultural differences. What Massasoit didn't realize was that Tisquantum had his own agenda. Tisquantum had lost everything: his family, his village, his place in the world. The plague had erased his identity, but now, suddenly, he had value. He was indispensable, the only person who could communicate between two groups that desperately needed each other. That gave him power, and Tisquantum intended to use it, not for the Wampanoag's benefit, not for the English's benefit, for his own. He would position himself as the essential intermediary, the only person who could maintain peace. He'd make himself so valuable to both sides that neither could afford to lose him. In a world that had taken everything from him, Tisquantum would rebuild his importance through the manipulation and control of information. On March 22, 1621, exactly 1 year after the Powhatan massacre in Virginia, though no one in Plymouth knew this, Massasoit's delegation approached Plymouth. They came in full diplomatic regalia. Painted faces, furs, feathered ornaments. Massasoit brought 60 warriors, enough to demonstrate strength, but not so many as to seem threatening. They stopped on a hill overlooking the settlement and waited. The colonists panicked. They'd seen indigenous people observing them from a distance for months, but this was the first direct approach. They grabbed their muskets and formed defensive positions. Then something extraordinary happened. A man walked down the hill toward Plymouth, alone, unarmed. He strode into the settlement and spoke, in English. "Welcome, Englishmen." The colonists were stunned, terrified, confused. The man introduced himself as Samoset, an Abenaki sachem from present-day Maine who'd learned some English from fishermen. He'd been visiting Massasoit when he heard about the colonists. Samoset explained that Massasoit wished to meet and discuss peace. He ate with the colonists, spent the night, and left the next day. A few days later, on March 22, Samoset returned with another man, Tisquantum, Subum. William Bradford, the colony's governor, later wrote, he could speak better English than himself. Bradford meant better than Samoset, but the comment reveals the colonists' shock. Tisquantum's English wasn't broken or halting. It was fluent, nuanced, sophisticated. The colonists bombarded him with questions. Where did you learn English? Who are you? What happened to the people who lived here? Tisquantum told them some of it. He explained that he was the last surviving member of Patuxet. A great plague had killed everyone while he was in England. That the land they'd settled on was his home. He didn't tell them about the kidnapping, didn't tell them about slavery. Didn't tell them how much he hated what they represented. Instead, he offered to help. He'd teach them to plant corn, show them where to fish, translate for Massasoit, facilitate the alliance. Why? The colonists assumed he was being kind, generous, Christian even. Some had preserved him specifically to help them. The truth was more complex. Tisquantum was playing a long game. He'd lost his world, but he'd found a new source of power. And he was going to exploit it. The Mayflower dropped anchor in Provincetown Harbor on November 11, 1620, after 66 days at sea. The 102 passengers, later called Pilgrims, though they never used that term themselves, were exhausted, sick, and desperate. They were religious separatists, mostly from England via Holland, fleeing persecution by the Church of England. They'd intended to settle in Virginia, where the established colony might offer some protection. But navigational errors and Atlantic storms had pushed them far north of their target. They'd landed in Cape Cod in territory controlled by the Wampanoag, with no legal claim to the land and no support from English authorities. They were illegal squatters with winter approaching and no shelter. Their situation was dire. Supplies were running low. The ship was leaking. People were sick. Scurvy, malnutrition, and respiratory infections contracted during the cramped, filthy voyage, and they had no idea how to survive in this environment. Most were city people, artisans, merchants, farmers from England's gentler climate. They'd never experienced a New England winter. Didn't know which plants were edible. Didn't know how to hunt local game or catch local fish. Without help, they would die. The first month was spent exploring Cape Cod, searching for a suitable settlement site. They needed fresh water, arable land, and a defensible position, and they needed food. During their explorations, they found something unexpected: buried caches of corn. These were indigenous stores, carefully hidden for later use. The corn had been harvested, dried, and buried in sealed baskets or pits to protect it from winter weather and animals. It was theft. The colonists knew it would hit, but they were starving. William Bradford, who would become the colony's governor, later wrote that they took as much corn as they could carry, intending to give them satisfaction when they should meet with any of them. That satisfaction never came. The corn they stole may have belonged to Patuxet, stored before the plague and never retrieved because everyone died. The colonists also looted indigenous graves, taking burial goods, tools, ornaments, and personal items interred with the dead. Bradford described this with remarkable casualness. We found a place like a grave, but it was much bigger and longer than any we had yet seen. It was covered with boards, so we dug it up and found first a mat, and under that a fine bow. Also bowls, trays, dishes, and sundry such things. We also found 2 bundles, one bigger and one smaller. The bigger we opened and found in it a great quantity of fine red powder and the bones and skull of a man. We brought sundry of the pretty things away with us. They robbed the dead and congratulated themselves on the pretty things. In late December, they finally found their ideal location, Patuxent. The site was perfect, a natural harbor deep enough for ships. 2 rivers provide fresh water. Fields already cleared and ready for planting, mysterious to the colonists who didn't yet understand they were standing on the ruins of a village. There were no inhabitants, no resistance, no complications. Edward Winslow, one of the colonists, later wrote, "There is a great deal of land cleared and hath been planted with corn 3 or 4 years ago. There is excellent good timber and very good fish." Many kinds of herbs we found here in winter. Strawberry leaves, innumerable sorrel, yarrow, liverwort. The ground is excellent, fat, black earth. What he described as virgin land was actually managed agricultural land, abandoned when everyone died. The colonists began building. The work was brutal. Winter had arrived. Temperatures plunged. Snow fell. Winds howled off the ocean. They constructed a common house first, a large shared structure for storage and shelter. The end, individual family homes, rough wooden buildings with thatched roofs and no windows. And people kept dying. The diseases that had started on the Mayflower intensified. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, scurvy. By spring, 45 of the original 102 colonists were dead, nearly half. Some days, 2 or 3 people died. Bodies were buried on a hill overlooking the settlement. The survivors tried to hide the graves, planting them over so that watching indigenous observers wouldn't realize how weak the colony had become. Families were shattered. Entire households were wiped out. Children orphaned. The few who remained were traumatized and terrified. Only 4 adult women survived the first winter. 4 out of 18 who'd arrived. The men who survived were largely those who could work outdoors, building, hunting, hauling. The women, children, and elderly, confined to the cold, damp common house, died in larger numbers. By March 1621, Plymouth was clinging to survival by its fingernails, and then Tisquantum appeared. To the colonists, his arrival seemed miraculous. A man who spoke perfect English, who knew the land, who offered to teach them everything they needed to survive. It was divine intervention. Proof that God favored their mission. Bradford later wrote, "Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation." Tisquantum taught them to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, burying alewives with the seeds to enrich the soil. He showed them which plants were edible, where to hunt deer and turkey, and how to catch eels and shellfish. He explained the seasonal patterns, when rivers would flood, when fish would migrate, and when to plant and harvest. Without this knowledge, the colonists would have starved. The corn they planted that spring, under Tisquantum's instruction, produced the harvest that saved them. But Tisquantum wasn't helping out of kindness. He was helping because it gave him power. The colonists depended on him completely. They couldn't survive without his knowledge. That made him indispensable. And Tisquantum intended to leverage that dependency to rebuild his shattered life. He'd lost his family, his village, his entire world. But standing in the ruins of Patuxet, teaching English invaders how to survive on land that was rightfully his, Tisquantum found a new purpose. He would become the most important person in Plymouth, the irreplaceable intermediary, the man both sides needed. And he would use that position to carve out power in a world that had taken everything from him, even if it meant betraying everyone. The treaty negotiated between Massasoit and Plymouth in March 1621 is one of the most consequential agreements in early American history. It was also built on mutual desperation. Massasoit needed English military support against the Narragansett. The English needed indigenous knowledge and political protection. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both needed the alliance to survive. Tisquantum brokered the meeting. On March 22, after introducing himself to the colonists and explaining his background, he returned to Massasoit with a message. The English were willing to negotiate. Massasoit assembled his delegation, 60 warriors, several lesser sachems, and interpreters. They approached Plymouth the next day. The colonists, terrified and outnumbered, tried to project strength they didn't have. They lined up their few remaining healthy men, armed with muskets, along the ridge overlooking the settlement. Massasoit stopped on the opposite hill and waited. This was a critical moment in diplomatic protocol. Neither leader wanted to appear weak by approaching first. Neither wanted to enter the other space without assurances of safety. Tisquantum shuttled between the two groups, negotiating the terms of the meeting itself. Finally, an arrangement was reached. Edward Winslow, one of the senior colonists, would go to Massasoit as a hostage, guaranteeing good faith. In exchange, Massasoit would send one of his men to Plymouth as a reciprocal hostage. Once this exchange was complete, Massasoit would enter Plymouth to meet with Governor John Carver. The colonists brought Massasoit to their largest building, more than a rough wooden structure, and laid out cushions and blankets to create the impression of status. Governor Carver greeted him. Tisquantum translated. What followed was a formal treaty negotiation, likely following indigenous diplomatic protocols as much as English ones. The terms, as recorded by William Bradford and Edward Winslow, were straightforward. First, neither side would harm the other. If any Wampanoag person injured an Englishman, Massasoit would send them to Plymouth for justice. If any Englishman harmed a Wampanoag, the colonists would deliver them to Massasoit. Second, if anyone stole from the other group, the stolen property would be returned. Third, if either side went to war with an outside enemy, the other would provide military assistance. Fourth, when Wampanoag people visited Plymouth, they would leave their weapons outside the settlement. When English people visited Wampanoag territory, they would do the same. Fifth, Massasoit would inform allied tribes of the agreement and encourage them to honor it. Sixth, when visiting each other, the groups would come unarmed. It was a mutual defense pact, trading relationship, and non-aggression treaty rolled into one. For Massasoit, the critical clause was the third, mutual military assistance. If the Narragansett attacked, the English would fight alongside the Wampanoag. That was the entire point. For the English, the treaty provided security. They were a tiny, vulnerable settlement surrounded by tens of thousands of indigenous people. Having the local power as an ally rather than an enemy was essential. Both sides lied during the negotiations. Massasoit inflated Wampanoag's strength, hiding how much the plague had weakened them. He wanted the English to see them as powerful allies, not desperate survivors. The English hid their own weakness, the 45 dead, the sickness, the near starvation. They wanted to appear strong, capable, and worth allying with, and Tisquantum manipulated both sides. He translated accurately enough to facilitate agreement, but he also inserted himself as the indispensable intermediary. He implied to the English that without him, they couldn't communicate with Massasoit. He suggested to Massasoit that the English trusted him specifically and might not honor agreements negotiated through others. He made himself essential. After the formal negotiations, the two leaders shared a meal, dried meat, cornbread, and whatever else Plymouth could scrape together. Massasoit reportedly tried the colonists' alcohol and didn't care for it. Then he and his delegation left, and the treaty was in effect. and the treaty was in effect. For the next several months, the relationship was surprisingly functional. Wampanoag people visited Plymouth regularly to trade. They brought furs, fish, and corn. The English traded metal tools, cloth, and beads. The colonists began planting under Tisquantum's instruction. He taught them the Three Sisters technique, planting corn, beans, and squash together. The corn provided a structure for beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil. The squash leaves shaded the ground, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. It was an agricultural technique refined over thousands of years. The colonists had no equivalent knowledge. Tisquantum also showed them how to fertilize corn by burying alewives, small fish that migrated up rivers by the thousands each spring. The decomposing fish enriched the soil, dramatically increasing yields. He took Englishmen on hunting and fishing expeditions, teaching them to read the landscape, track game, and set traps. Without Tisquantum, Plymouth would have failed. The harvest of 1621, the corn planted under his instruction, was the difference between survival and starvation. In the fall, the colonists celebrated with a harvest feast. They invited Massasoit and the Wampanoag as a diplomatic gesture. Massasoit brought 90 people and 5 deer. The feast lasted 3 days. This event would later be mythologized as the first Thanksgiving, a narrative of friendship, cooperation, and shared gratitude. The reality was more transactional. It was a diplomatic feast, a political event reinforcing the alliance. The Wampanoag and English didn't see each other as equals or friends. They saw each other as useful. Massasoit was using the English to counter the Narragansett threat. The English were using the Wampanoag for food, knowledge, and protection. And Tisquantum was using both sides to rebuild his shattered life. He lived in Plymouth, not among the Wampanoag. He ate with the colonists, dressed partially in English clothing, and positioned himself as their essential guide. But he also maintained relationships with Massasoit, translating, facilitating, and mediating. He was the bridge between worlds, and he intended to keep it that way, because as long as both sides needed him, he mattered. And in a world that had taken everything, mattering was all he had left. By the summer of 1621, Tisquantum had positioned himself as the most important person in Plymouth. He lived among the colonists, sleeping in their homes, eating at their tables. He accompanied their expeditions, translated their negotiations, and advised their decisions. Governor Bradford came to rely on him completely, later writing that Tisquantum was a special instrument sent of God for their good. But Tisquantum wasn't an instrument of God. He was a deeply traumatized survivor playing a dangerous political game, and he was willing to lie, manipulate, and betray to maintain his position. The first sign of his duplicity came in the summer of 1621, when Tisquantum began telling other indigenous groups that the English had a secret weapon. He claimed the colonists controlled the plague. They could release it at will, he said, targeting specific tribes or villages. The disease was stored in barrels buried beneath Plymouth. If any tribe attacked or defied the English, the sickness would be unleashed. This was a brilliant and horrifying lie. It exploited the most traumatic experience of every surviving indigenous person in the region. They'd watched the plague kill their families. They had no understanding of how diseases worked, no concept of immunity or contagion. If Tisquantum, the sole Patuxet survivor, a man who'd lived among the English, said they controlled the plague, it was terrifyingly plausible, and it gave the English enormous power. Smaller tribes, terrified of another outbreak, became more compliant. They sent tribute to Plymouth. They avoided conflict. They treated the tiny, struggling colony as a dangerous power. The English had no idea this was happening. They didn't speak the language. They didn't understand the regional politics. They thought their growing influence was due to superior English civilization or divine favor. It was actually due to Tisquantum's manipulation. But the lies served Tisquantum's purposes. The more powerful the English seemed, the more valuable he became as their translator and intermediary. He also began undermining Massasoit. Tisquantum told the colonists that Massasoit was unreliable, potentially treacherous. He suggested that other sachems might be better allies. He implied that without Tisquantum's personal intervention, the Wampanoag might turn hostile. This was a direct challenge to Massasoit's authority. The Pokanoket sachem had negotiated the treaty personally. He'd honored its terms. He'd provided military support when Plymouth needed it. But Tisquantum was positioning himself as the real power, the essential intermediary without whom the alliance would collapse. Massasoit began hearing reports of Tisquantum's activities, heard that he was telling other tribes the English controlled the plague, heard that he was speaking against Massasoit to the colonists. By early 1622, Massasoit had had enough. He sent a messenger to Plymouth with a demand: hand over Tisquantum. He'd committed treason, undermined Wampanoag authority, and spread dangerous lies. Under Indigenous law, he deserved execution. Governor Bradford faced an impossible choice. Tisquantum had saved Plymouth. He was still essential, the only fluent English speaker, the only person who could navigate between English and Indigenous worlds. Losing him would cripple the colony's ability to trade, negotiate, and survive. But refusing Massasoit risked shattering the alliance, and without Wampanoag protection, Plymouth was vulnerable to attack from the Narragansett or other hostile tribes. Bradford stalled. He told Massasoit's messenger that Tisquantum was too valuable to surrender. He suggested Massasoit was being unreasonable. Massasoit, furious, sent another delegation, this time with a more specific accusation. Tisquantum had conspired with the Massachusetts tribe to attack both Plymouth and the Wampanoag, then seize power for himself in the resulting chaos. The evidence was murky, but Massasoit insisted Tisquantum was a traitor and a liar. Bradford still refused to hand him over. The relationship between Plymouth and Massasoit deteriorated. The trust that had been built through the 1621 treaty was fracturing, and Tisquantum kept playing both sides. He told the English that Massasoit was planning to betray them, that he needed to be watched carefully. He told other Indigenous groups that he could protect them from both English aggression and Wampanoag domination. He was trying to make himself indispensable to everyone, the only person who could maintain peace, but he was also making enemies everywhere. The Wampanoag saw him as a traitor, other tribes saw him as a manipulator, and some colonists were beginning to suspect his stories didn't always add up. In the fall of 1622, Tisquantum accompanied an English expedition led by Captain Miles Standish to trade with Indigenous groups around Cape Cod. The expedition was tense. Relations with several tribes had deteriorated, partly due to English arrogance, partly due to Tisquantum's manipulations. While navigating the coast, Tisquantum fell suddenly ill. The symptoms came on quickly: high fever, severe headache, nosebleeds. Bradford, who was present, later wrote, "Squanto fell sick of an Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians take for a symptom of death. Within days, Tisquantum was dying. Bradford sat with him as he weakened." According to Bradford's account, Tisquantum's final words were a request for Bradford to pray to the Christian God on his behalf that he might go to the Englishman's heaven. It's a suspiciously convenient detail, exactly the kind of deathbed conversion narrative that Puritan writers loved. Whether Tisquantum actually said this or whether Bradford invented it is unknowable. What's certain is that Tisquantum died in November 1622, approximately 18 months after first meeting the Plymouth colonists. He was buried somewhere near modern Chatham, Massachusetts. No marker, no ceremony recorded, just another grave in a land full of them. The cause of death is unclear. The fever and nosebleeds could indicate several diseases, but some historians have speculated he was poisoned, possibly by Wampanoag agents, possibly by someone else he'd betrayed. Bradford never investigated. He simply noted the death and moved on. With Tisquantum gone, Plymouth lost its primary translator and Indigenous affairs advisor. But the colony had learned enough to survive without him. They'd planted crops successfully. They'd established trade relationships. They'd begun learning the language themselves. Tisquantum had made himself essential, but not irreplaceable. And when he died, Plymouth didn't collapse. Massasoit, hearing of Tisquantum's death, likely felt relief. The troublemaker was gone. The alliance with Plymouth could stabilize without his interference. Tisquantum had spent his final years trying to rebuild power in a shattered world. He'd manipulated, lied, and betrayed. And in the end, he died alone, far from home, trusted by no one. The story Americans tell themselves about Plymouth begins with brave pilgrims, a harsh winter, and friendly Indians who taught them to survive. It's a comforting narrative, clean, simple. morally uncomplicated. It's also a lie by omission. The lie began immediately in the writings of the colonists themselves. William Bradford, Plymouth's governor and primary chronicler, wrote extensively about the colony's founding in his work of Plymouth Plantation. He described the landing, the first winter, the treaty with Massasoit, Tisquantum's assistance, but about the plague that killed thousands and cleared the land for English settlement, almost nothing. He mentions finding skulls and bones. He notes the empty villages. He writes briefly that a great sickness had swept through before their arrival. Then he moves on. Edward Winslow, another Pilgrim leader, was slightly more direct. In his 1624 work, Good News from New England, he wrote that God had made way for them by removing the heathen and planting them there. The plague became providence. Mass death became divine intervention. This wasn't accidental. It was a theological necessity. The Pilgrims were separatists, religious radicals who believed they were God's chosen people, establishing a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. Their survival, their success, had to be divinely ordained. Acknowledging that they'd succeeded because a plague had conveniently exterminated the local population raised uncomfortable questions. Was God using the weapon? Were they benefiting from, even celebrating, mass death? Better not to think about it. Better to focus on their own struggles, their own faith, their own triumph. So the plague disappeared from the narrative. By the time the first Thanksgiving story crystallized in American culture, largely in the 19th century, the plague was completely absent. The story became Pilgrims and Indians sat down together in peace and harmony, sharing harvest bounty, grateful for mutual friendship. No mention that the indigenous people at that meal were plague survivors. No mention that they were desperately seeking a military alliance against rivals. No mention that the corn the Pilgrims served had been stolen from Patuxet graves. The mythology required innocence. It required the land to be virgin, empty, waiting, destined for English settlement. Abraham Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863 during the Civil War as a symbol of American unity and divine blessing. The Pilgrim story became foundational to American identity. School textbooks throughout the 20th century repeated the sanitized version. Pilgrims in black hats, wouldn't I, this school. Indians in feathers, turkey and corn, gratitude and cooperation. The plague erased. Even Tisquantum was transformed in the mythology. He became Squanto, the friendly Indian who inexplicably spoke English and selflessly helped the Pilgrims. No mention of his enslavement, his trauma. And his manipulation, his desperate attempts to navigate a post-apocalyptic world. He was reduced to a supporting character in the English story, a convenient helper who appeared when needed, then died when no longer necessary. But indigenous people never forgot. Wampanoag oral traditions preserved the memory of the plague. They told of the great dying, the empty villages, the grief that followed. They remembered that Plymouth was built on Patuxet bones. In 1970, during the 350th anniversary of Plymouth's founding, a Wampanoag man was invited to speak at the official commemoration. He prepared a speech describing the real history, the plague, the land theft, the destruction of his people. The organizers read his speech in advance and told him he couldn't deliver it. It was too political, too uncomfortable. He refused to give a different speech. Instead, he and other indigenous activists organized a counter-commemoration. They declared Thanksgiving a national day of mourning. Every year since, indigenous people gather at Plymouth on Thanksgiving to mourn, to remember, and to correct the record. They stand on the site of Patuxet and speak the truth the mythology won't acknowledge. This land was not empty. It was empty by disease, by violence, by deliberate forgetting. The plague that cleared New England for colonization wasn't unique. Across the Americas, European diseases killed 90% of indigenous populations within a century of contact. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, plague. Each epidemic was followed by European expansion into empty land. Each expansion was justified as divine providence. Each providence required forgetting the graves beneath the settlements. The Patuxet Plague matters because it reveals the pattern. It shows how mythology overwrites history, how suffering becomes providence, how mass death becomes a feel-good holiday. In 2020, during the 400th anniversary of Plymouth's founding, some progress was made. Museums and historical sites began acknowledging the plague. Media coverage included indigenous voices. But the core mythology persists. Most Americans still learn the Thanksgiving story without the plague, still celebrate without mourning, still imagine the Pilgrims' success as inevitable, divinely ordained, innocent. The plague remains inconvenient to the narrative America tells itself about its founding. Because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that English colonization succeeded not through superiority or divine favor, but through catastrophe. That Plymouth was built on Indigenous death, that Thanksgiving celebrates the apocalypse. It would require seeing Tisquantum not as Squanto the friendly Indian, but as a traumatized survivor, navigating impossible choices in the ruins of his world. It would require admitting that the American dream was built on someone else's nightmare. And that's a truth the mythology was designed to hide. The Patuxet Plague didn't just kill people, it killed possibilities. Before 1616, coastal New England was densely populated. The Wampanoag Confederacy alone numbered perhaps 20,000 people. The Massasoit, the Nauset, the Pokanoket, tens of thousands more. These weren't scattered bands. They were organized societies with complex governance, extensive trade networks, and military alliances. If they had remained at full strength when the English arrived, history would have been different. The Pilgrims, 102 sick, starving religious refugees, would have faced overwhelming Indigenous power. They would have had to negotiate from weakness, accept Indigenous terms, live as guests, not conquerors. Maybe they would have been driven out entirely. Instead, they found emptiness, not true wilderness. The land showed evidence of cultivation everywhere. Fields, cleared forests, trails, but the people who created that landscape were gone. The demographic collapse gave the English something invaluable, space to establish themselves before Indigenous nations could respond effectively. By the time the Wampanoag and other surviving groups understood the English threat, Plymouth was entrenched. More ships were arriving. More settlements were forming. The plague had created a power vacuum, and the English filled it. This pattern repeated across the Americas. Wherever European diseases preceded European settlers, colonization became exponentially easier. Not through military conquest, but through biological catastrophe. The Spanish conquered the Aztec Empire not because a few hundred conquistadors defeated millions of indigenous warriors, but because smallpox killed 40% of the population during the siege of Tenochtitlan. The Portuguese dominated Brazil's coast because epidemics had already shattered Tupinamba resistance. The French expanded through the Great Lakes region following waves of disease that decimated the Huron and other nations. These weren't separate events. They were one catastrophe unfolding across continents, the greatest demographic collapse in human history. An estimated 90 million indigenous people died within a century of 1492. The Patuxet Plague was just one wave in this ocean of death. For the survivors, the trauma was incomprehensible. Imagine losing 90% of everyone you knew, your family, your community, your entire world. The knowledge keepers are dead, the children are dead, the future is dead. Now imagine strangers arriving to claim your empty houses, plant your cleared fields, and declare it divine providence. This is what Tisquantum lived through, what Massasoit navigated, what every plague survivor endured. Some collaborated with colonizers out of desperation, others resisted. Most simply tried to survive in a shattered world. Their descendants carry that trauma still. The Mashpee Wampanoag tribe today numbers about 3,000 people. They're descendants of plague survivors, people who lost 75% of their population in 3 years, then spent 4 centuries fighting for survival against English and later American expansion. They achieved federal recognition only in 2007, after decades of legal battles to prove they'd continuously existed since before European contact. Think about that. They had to prove they existed on land they'd inhabited for 12,000 years. In the shadow of Plymouth, the colony built on its relatives' graves, the Patuxent Tisquantum people no longer exist as a distinct tribe. The plague erased them. Their language is extinct, their customs forgotten. Their stories are lost. All that remains is the name, corrupted by English tongues. Patuxet became Plymouth. The indigenous place became the English place. The grave became the garden. But the land remembers. In 2019, archaeologists excavating in downtown Plymouth found indigenous artifacts beneath colonial foundations. Stone tools, pottery shards, evidence of thousands of years of habitation. The English didn't build on virgin land. They built on top of indigenous history, literally and figuratively. Every American city on the eastern seaboard sits on indigenous land cleared by disease. Boston was in Massachusetts. Manhattan was Lenape. Philadelphia was Susquehannock. The plague made it all possible. Without epidemic disease, Europeans would have faced unified indigenous resistance from millions of people defending their homelands. Colonization might have failed, or succeeded only through negotiation and genuine coexistence. Instead, disease did the work of conquest. This isn't ancient history. It's a living memory for indigenous people. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, it hit indigenous communities disproportionately hard. The Navajo Nation had higher infection rates than any U.S. state. Memories of past plagues, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis shaped the response. Indigenous communities knew what epidemic disease could do. Their ancestors had lived through an apocalypse. The Patuxet Plague also reveals something about historical memory itself. The Pilgrims' descendants wrote the history books. They controlled the narrative. They decided what to remember and what to forget. They remembered their own suffering, the harsh winter, the starving time, their faith. They forgot indigenous suffering, the plague, the displacement, the centuries of survival against genocidal policies. This selective memory shaped American identity. It created a story where colonization was heroic, divinely blessed, and inevitable. But it wasn't inevitable, it was contingent on catastrophe. If the plague hadn't struck precisely when it did, after Tisquantum's kidnapping but before the Pilgrims' arrival, Plymouth would have failed. If Massasoit hadn't been desperate for allies against the Narragansett, he would have destroyed the colony. If Tisquantum hadn't survived and returned, the Pilgrims would have had no translator, no teacher, no political bridge. History balanced on impossibly thin margins, and at every margin was death. Today, Plymouth Rock sits under a neoclassical monument. Tourists take photos. School children learn about Pilgrims' courage. A few hundred yards away, a plaque marks the site of Patuxent. Most visitors don't see it, don't know how to look for it. But it's there, a small acknowledgement of the thousands who died. The world that was lost, the emptiness that made Plymouth possible. The plague gave the English a foothold in New England. That foothold became colonies. Colonies became states, became a nation. America was built on indigenous graves. And until that truth is fully acknowledged, taught in schools, commemorated in holidays, written into the national story, the ghosts of Patuxet remain unquiet. The land remembers what the mythology forgets. The emptiness was never empty. It was full of the dead.